Good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, all about why upgrade to Capture One Pro 10. So the purpose really today is to show you, excuse me, the path of evolution that's happened since version 8 through to 10. So you can decide whether decide for yourself whether you think we are worthy of an upgrade or not. If you don't know who you're listening to, and this is perhaps your first webinar, my name's David. I'm part of the software sales team based out of Copenhagen in Denmark. And as usual, we have a 60-minute session today. We will probably use most of that, I would think. You're very welcome and encouraged to ask questions throughout. If you look at the bottom of your control panel, the last box you'll see is called question. So just put a question there that will come straight through to me. If you're on your Android device or iOS device, you'll see a question mark icon at the bottom. Just tap that and you can ask a question in the same way. The session is being recorded too, so it will be hosted on our brand new Capture One YouTube channel probably sometime tomorrow. And in the follow-up email, which you'll see in roughly 1 hour from now or 2 hours from now, then you'll be able to find that link. Please subscribe and then you can watch again. With regards to your questions, try to keep them on subject. Just not only helps me, but also helps everyone else who is listening as well. So let's get started. So before we dive straight to Capture One, I just wanted to discuss 3 things that can happen in an update. So the first thing that we tend to update is the processing engine. And if you don't know what that means, that's basically the, excuse me, mathematics, brains, algorithm, whatever you want to call it, behind the processing of Capture One. So what we do to your raw file that gives you the end result. Now this normally relates to image quality facets, so sharpness details, color facets like color processing and so on. The result that the tools have on the image, so when you drag a slider, how does that affect the image? And it can also affect performance, so how fast does it take for an adjustment to be applied, or how quickly is it to browse between images or zoom and so on. So the processing engine handles all things image related, but also performance. We may add new tools or we may update existing tools to make them better from upgrade to upgrade. And we could add something, maybe not necessarily a tool in itself, but some way to aid your workflow. So what we do today is basically look at how the processing engine has influenced your images, what new tools came along and perhaps how they've been updated, and also some workflow additions as well, and any other new stuff that I can think of as well. So now let's go, one too far. Now let's go over to Capture One. So just bear with me. Right now you should see Capture One on screen as well. And we should be good to go in just a second. All right, so let's start with the processing engine. Now, if you've never really seen where your processing engine is listed, then what you need to pay attention to, and I'm going to drag this out so we can see it at all times, is the base characteristics tool. And that shows you exactly what processing engine is being used on the currently selected image. So you see this one down here. So this one here, actually I'm going to reset that as somehow I'd made it black and white. That's better. So what we can see here, this same image, you can see the file name is the same, is on the Capture One 10 engine and on the Capture One 8 engine. So it makes it very easy to compare. Now, if you have lots of time on your hands, probably maybe too much time in this case, and you want to do the same exercise yourself, if you look in the Capture One preferences, you'll see under the image tab that you can actually choose which processing engine you want to use. So if I was to select an older processing engine, let's grab version 8 for example, find any image, let's just grab this image for example, and create a new variant, that's a virtual copy, you'll see that the new variant is actually using the older processing engine. So if you want to compare, then you can do so. I'm sure you've got better things to do, but it is possible if you wish. Let me just change that preference back. Otherwise, I'm going to forget. So Processing engine. What sort of things can we see different in processing engines as we come up? Now, between version 8 to 9 and of course to 10, there was quite big changes. And what does that actually look like in real time? So let's hide my browser for a second and let's zoom in so we can see a bit better. So if I shift click on my big head over here, like so, let's just do a shift click, then we zoom to 100%. And if I spacebar drag, or sorry, shift spacebar drag, then we can bring both of them to align at the same time. Now, the processing engine could affect all kinds of adjustments, but something significant between 8 and 9, if you're still on an older version, was extensive changes into the exposure tool. So if we look at this image here, we're on 10, this image here, we're on 8 like so. So let's do a heavy contrast slider adjustment like so, and let's do exactly the same adjustment on version 10. And you can see version 10, version 8, quite different. Traditionally, you might think that dragging a slider, especially a contrast slider, was maybe a foolhardy thing to do. You should be using a more pro tool like the curves, which we'll come to in a minute. And with version 8, you'd probably be right, because you can see if you are heavy-handed with the contrast tool, you can see that the color has shifted quite a bit. The saturation has shifted quite a bit. And if we look in the shadows, we've got 0 shadow detail. And if we look on the shoulder highlight there, this one down here, then it's pretty much gone to nothing. Whereas in the Capture One 10 version, yes, we've got an increase in contrast, but you see the color is very stable. Our shadows, while darker, they're not totally destroyed, and we've got a better handling of the highlight, so it's not as burnt out as it would be with version 8. So that's quite an extensive change to the underlying changes to the exposure tool. We can also see the same thing with brightness. Let's just reduce those back down to normal, and we do the same thing, full brightness like so, and full brightness. Brightness is basically a mid-tone bump. So again, if we look at perhaps the shoulder here, look at the difference there. No highlight detail whatsoever, completely destroyed, much better handled with Capture One 10, you can see on the left. So important changes like so. So that also, now seeing as we're talking about the contrast slider, that's actually a good opportunity to then talk about changes that came along in version 9. So later, not version 8, in version 9, which was with the luminosity curve as well. So let's just grab a different image and bring this one up. Zoom back out. Thank you. Before I do, I'll just answer a couple of questions. Good one, actually. Carol is asking, when I'm up to 8 to 10, do I uninstall the previous versions? You can do, but you don't have to. But you can't run an old version at the same time as a new version. But you don't necessarily have to uninstall, but you probably want to, I would think. Ruggiero is asking, how can I make your desktop full screen? Oh, you're talking about the GoToWebinar viewer. Just expand it out. I'm afraid I don't know what you're viewing on, so hopefully you've figured it out by now. Yes, there are differences on the processing engine between 9 and 10, and we'll come to those in a second, don't worry. So what I wanted to mention was the Luma curve. So if you're still sitting on 8 again, or even an older version, then it's quite different. But it's also, for any of you watching who have upgraded, it's really good to know how the contrast slider works in version 10. So what I'm going to do is just clone. We're going to put you away. We don't need you now. I'm just going to clone this image a couple of times. Like so. So we've got 3 virtual copies, and then let's get rid of base characteristics. And what we're also going to do is grab 2 curve tools. So let's just collapse those down. And I'm going to add yet another curve tool, which you might think that's a strange thing to do, but bear with me, you'll see why. Let's make this one bigger. So we've got an RGB option and a Luma option. So let's, with our first image, let's just do a pretty much standard RGB curve. So I want to add some contrast on my image, so I'll just apply an RGB curve like so. Great. Let's go to the next image, which is the same one again, But this time, let's do a luminosity curve, like so. Straight away, even without seeing the previous image, which is this one, you can probably see the difference if I go back and forth. So again, when we use an RGB curve, we can't but help affect our color and saturation as well, which could be an unwanted effect. So with the luminosity curve, it's pure contrast only. So our color remains stable and our saturation of colors remains stable as well. No hue shift or nothing. So the luma curve gives you that perfect separation. Now, what about if we go to our next image and instead of using curves, let's just drag our contrast slider like so, till we get a similar kind of contrast level that we did before. And if we look at them all three together, like so, and then we can look at the difference. So if you remember, so this one was with our RGB curve. Let's get that right. So this was with our RGB curve. Let's bring our exposure down here so you can see. The next one is with our luma curve. And then the third one was with the contrast slider. Now the interesting thing is you can see what's going on here with RGB. We've got our increase in saturation, luminosity, everything is nice and stable, but the contrast slider, it fits somewhere very nicely in between those two. So whereas before with the older versions of Capture One, you might have been afraid to use the contrast slider, right now, when you upgrade to version 10, it's a great compromise between pure RGB and luminosity, because sometimes when you're using the luma curve, you might think for it to be natural, you might want to tweak the saturation a bit, because when we increase saturation on an image, our brains naturally expect for the saturation to get a bit kind of brighter. If you think about going outdoors on a nice sunny day, everything looks more contrasty and more exciting and better and so on. If you think of a flat grey day, everything looks flatter. So when contrast goes up, we expect colour to be a bit more saturated as well. So the contrast slider is a great in-between between pure RGB and pure luminosity. So don't be afraid to use it. Also changes that we saw that came along with Capture One 10 as well. Let's go back to this image. Just check what engine I'm on. Let's just reset my workspace so I know what I'm looking at. So that's our Capture One 8. That's not the one we want. We want this one, Capture One 10. So also with the color editor, and we spoke about earlier where we could improve tools and update tools, then this is something we certainly did with the color editor. So let's look at this shot, and in particular, let's look at the skin tone tab. And you'll see in the skin tone tab that we've got a bank of sliders here under uniformity called hue, saturation, and lightness. Now in version 8 and 9, we only had one slider, which was simply just uniformity. So that tried to do a good job of creating a uniform color across skin, but without the addition of saturation and lightness. So what we can do now is, as well as evening out the color of skin, we can also even out the saturation levels and the density levels. So if we look at this portrait in particular, you can see that the skin tone here, and let's say just on the collarbone around here, on the face and so on, actually varies quite a bit, which is fine. None of us have perfect skin tone, but to actually try and fix that in Photoshop, for example, is a bit more of a challenge, but it's very simple to do so in Capture One with the new tools. Now, generally, it makes sense if we do this on a local adjustment to avoid affecting any other areas. So I'm going to make a quick layer. Let's just call that skin. Grab a brush. Right click to get my settings up. Incidentally, you'll also see that we've added, as another new feature, flow control to local adjustment drawing, which really helps us to build up a mask gradually if we need to. So instead of the mask being applied all in one stroke, if we lower the flow down, we can gradually build up a mask. But in this case, let's just do a quick mask over our skin area, for example. I just do this section. We can fill our mask to save time, and let's just grab an erase mask brush and just take out couple of areas which we don't necessarily want to be affected. Now you probably spend a bit more time doing this than me, but you don't want to sit here watching me drawing a mask, so I'll be nice and quick. Okay, so we have a mask on our skin area. So let's go to our color editor, go to the skin tone tab, and then look on our subject and think, where is a decent skin tone? So I'm going to pick somewhere around there. And that gives me a selected color range or a suggested color range in the skin tone tab. And I can drag this range out nicely. And something else that we did was that now the color editor is scalable. So it makes it easier to use if you're doing like very small range selections or larger ones. So if I expand this range out as much as possible, that dot is my picked point. What happens when I drag these uniformity sliders is that everything within that range is going to be transformed to my picked color. So if we go hue, like so, you can see the skin change, saturation, and then lightness. Obviously, we don't want to go too far because then it can look a little bit unnatural. So let's just back those off a bit and then we get a nice blend between old and new. Let's pop the color editor back down there. And now if we turn that layer off, you can see the difference before and after. And I'm probably doing this to a greater extent than I normally would, but you can see the effect for evening out the skin tone nicely, which would be a much bigger challenge if you had to do that. So updates coming in 9 and 10 was the addition of the saturation and lightness sliders over the norm, and the fact that we could scale our color editor nicely as well. Okay, so just to answer Gatan's question. Oh, it's a long question. Oh, about macOS. Yes, that's a good point. With regards to operating systems that we support the last two, so Sierra 1012 and the last one 1011 El Capitan. We don't go further back than that because it actually is very difficult to continue support and to try and support older OSs as well. Capture One pulls heavily on a lot of deep OS stuff to help performance and so on and so forth, and we can't do that when the OS system gets to a certain point. So as a rule, we try to support the current and the last one. Not only does that give you better performing software, it also gives you more stable software as well. In terms for the PC users, then it's Windows 7 up through to 10, of course. Shoshana says it changes the selected color. Can you say what again it does to the pick color? Yes. So if you imagine, so every color in this selection, so in this range, the more I drag the slider to the right, everything gets zoop, transformed to that picked color. So if we just put these all back to 0, like so, we've got as it looks. The more I drag the hue to the right, the more all the hues in that range get transformed to the picked color, thus making the skin even. Then we linearize the saturation and then the lightness if you wish as well. Okay, going back now to kind of an older version of Capture One, let's grab this one. So let's see what version we're on here. I think we're going definitely back to the dark ages here, but there could be some of you who are still on an older version. And I'll just do this briefly. Capture One 7, Capture One 10, we can see over here. Image looks out of the box pretty much the same. But just to give you an example of other tweaks, if we just grab shadows and highlights on HDR, and then do the same for Capture One 10, shadows and highlights on HDR, look at the difference. So Capture One 7 doesn't look too pretty, solarized and so on. Capture One 10, like so, even with an extreme adjustment like that, I personally probably wouldn't go that far. But if we go and try and do the same, you can see we have a much more natural, pleasant result on Capture One 10 compared to Capture One 7, and we can't really recreate that with 7. So if you're still on 7, then the HDR range slider alone is a good reason to update. A 10 only feature coming up. Let's just grab some chilies here, for example, and go to sharpening. So let's zoom in to 100%. Nice sharp shot from 80 megapixels, I think. Let's bring up the sharpening tool. And in Capture 110, we added the halo suppressant slider. So what does that actually mean as such? So if we increase our amount and we want to be quite aggressive with our sharpening, and I'll go really aggressive, let's go to 200%. If you're a bit too aggressive with your sharpening, you start to see halos like this black-white shadow along the edge, like so. But what we can do is then move up halo suppressant and it gets rid of that halo, but maintains the sharpness of the image quite nicely. So we can be quite aggressive with that slider. So we're back down at 100%. So we've got quite heavy sharpening and the halo suppression slider. Nice sharp image, but not looking ugly with halos. Now, if we option click to temp reset, then you can see before and after. If we go back to 200%, so that's before and after like so. So we get the nice increase in sharpness, but without having those nasty halos as such, like so. And if we turn halo suppressant off, you can see, and the halo suppressant gets rid of the halos, but maintains the sharpness of the image. Now, in conjunction with that, we also have a proofing function. So let's say we decided this is the level of sharpening. Let's just go a little bit less aggressive, David. So this is the sharpening that we wanted to have on our image, and then we were going to go to export. Now, when we export, we might not necessarily keep our image at the full size. So we might make the image smaller. We might at times make it larger as well. So let's say we were going to export at 1600 pixels for the web on our process recipe here. Now, when we export this and we resize it to 1600 pixels across, bearing in mind the original dimensions are 10,000 pixels across, whenever we reduce an image or enlarge it, we have a negative impact on the sharpening. But really, we have no idea what that impact is going to be until we export the image, have a look at it, and then decide if we need to make a change. But in Capture 110, if you look for your spectacles icon on the toolbar, then we can proof exactly how the export is going to look. So we're at 100%, so we're viewing at 100%. As soon as I turn spectacles on, then it proofs down to my currently selected process recipe. So now I can see in the Capture One viewer exactly what this is going to look like at 1600 pixels across. If I just change this quickly to 2500, then you'll see the image change like so. Now, if I think the reduction of that image has negatively affected the sharpening, we can go to our Adjustments tab, and then we can apply some additional output sharpening for screen or print. Or we can do a nice thing. If we're going to retouch, we can disable all sharpening if we want to. And you saw the image change there. Let's do sharpening for screen, disable all sharpening like so. So if we want to add a little bit more in, we can just dial in sharpness values like so until we get something which we think is going to look better. Also, we're proofing JPEG compression. So there's no point really having JPEG compression up to 100. It's kind of overkill, and it's going to make us a very big, approximately 4 megabyte file. So the estimated size here was improved in Capture 110 as well. So we can drag down the quality slider until we get a feeling that, okay, I can have relatively high JPEG compression, but still retain quality and have a decent file size as well. So certainly at this pixel dimensions, we could probably get away with a pretty low pixel quality, for example. So that's proofing by turning that on new in Capture 110. Visualize your JPEG compression, your quality, JPEG quality, your ICC profile, and the absolute export dimensions as well. So it takes the guesswork out of that export process. When I export an 8-bit TIFF, I get a preview. Dominic saying if I export a 16-bit TIFF, I get no thumbnail, probably because you've disabled it. This one here, create thumbnails on save. I imagine that box is not checked on your 16-bit TIFF. Okay, what's next? So that was our sharpening and proofing. So what about new tools? let's just pop sharpening back home. New tools, you've already seen the Luma Curve. Great addition. So good for all kinds of photography and keeping that color stable, especially for skin tones and portraiture and so on. Let's just change my collection and turn off proofing. We don't need to proof anymore. Another new tool that popped up in 8. So again, this is for those of you who are still on 7, which is probably very few of you. But this tool often goes unmissed because it's kind of sort of hidden away in the details area. And we spoke a lot about it in version 8, but haven't said much since, which is the film grain tool. Which is probably the best grain emulation on the market, I would think. Now, most grain emulation applications tend to be based on scanning a piece of film and then just creating some kind of overlay on the image. But we decided that wasn't really a very natural way of doing it because the grain pattern changes slightly depending on whether we're looking at shadows, midtones, highlights, and basically the underlying image. So we wanted a grain tool that was dynamic with the image itself. So instead, we looked at various different films and then we created a mathematical, if you like, emulation of those various different grain structures. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different grain types here. Fine grain is just a really sort of basic one that isn't as sophisticated as the others. So you can pick your grain type, drag up impact, which is pretty much the opacity, so how visible is the grain on the underlying image itself, and then the granularity, how grainy it is itself. And you get a really lovely natural looking grain with various different options that you can pick, like so. Over the image and experiment with how much impact and how much granularity you have. So if you haven't discovered it, doesn't necessarily have to be for black and white only, of course. Can be really nice on color images just for taking the edge off something. It's a good trick, especially for me. If you haven't quite got something in focus, it's a good way of masking that a little bit as well. So film grain tool, just worth mentioning if you haven't seen it. Couple of your questions. Let's see. Oh, that was about synchronization from David. Can see one basically. I'm just speed reading your question. Can we apply one single adjustment across images? Yes. So very quickly, we've got. Let's just select all of these. Let's do film grain in this case. So if I want to apply the same film grain settings across to this image, let's just bump that up so it's quite high because some of these don't have any film grain. All we need to do, hold your shift key down and click up the little up down arrow in the tool itself. So if I do that now, then you see every single image has exactly the same film grain setting. Let's just change that again. Shift click the little up down arrow, boom, like so. Now every single image has exactly the film grain setting. And you could do that with noise reduction, sharpening, and so on and so forth. Can you control the grain within the shadows and highlights? Deborah's asking. No, it's automatic. So it basically behaves as the emulsion would have done, as close as we can replicate as such. Chris is asking, good question, Chris, had it this morning. How many of these features that I'm showing in Pro 10 are available in the Sony version of Pro 10? It's all exactly the same. So the only difference between Pro 10 and Pro 10 for Sony is camera support. Features is exactly the same. So Pro 10 for Sony, Sony cameras only. Capture on Pro, 400 plus cameras. Otherwise, everything is identical. Okay, so let me just say yes to David. David was asking if that was the only change. That's correct. So if I wanted to do crop David, for example, crop, like so, shift click the up down arrow, and you'll see that the depends on the adjustment. Sometimes it takes longer. You'll see that my crop has been applied to all those images, but everything else remains the same. Okie dokie. So the next new tool that we want to look at is maybe not so new, but again extremely useful, is the color balance tool, which also often gets overlooked as well and fairly unique to Capture One. So if you haven't used the color balance tool, again, it popped up in Capture One 8 as well. Very simple to use. There's a whole webinar you can look at in the archive about color grading and color editing as well. But essentially, the color balance tool influenced heavily from the video editing industry, who've been doing this way before us still guys cottoned onto it. But essentially, we have a master tab which allows you, let's just reset this tool, a master tab which allows you to put any color tint over the whole image as such, pretty much like putting a filter in front of the lens. Double click anywhere to reset to 0. And then the three-way tool allows us to put a individual color on shadows, midtones, and highlights. And we can also influence the contrast by dragging the slider on the right-hand side. So another way of influencing contrast too, other than the curve tool, levels tool, contrast slider, and so on. But some people prefer to use this purely for contrast. What we added in 10, which is why I just wanted to mention the color balance tool, is support for a range of hardware input panels. And it started with, let's just go back to the home page. Initially, it started with this product, the Ripple. So you can probably guess what that does. That gives you a hardware interface into the 3 circles by using 3 trackables and 3 rotational dials at the top for the density changes. So that gave us a good hardware inroad into using the color balance tool. Basically, you can just look at the image, you roll the trackables without really having to pay any attention to the tool itself. So then it also made sense to try and one-up ourselves and go for the full application, which was a different product from the same company called the Element range, which is essentially 4 different panels. So a similar kind of panel, but high quality materials for using the color balance tool. A multi-function panel for using this for controlling local adjustment brushes, for example, selecting of images, shortcuts, and so on. And then rotational dials for adjustments, and then buttons for simple shortcuts. So this basically gives you an entire analog interface into operating Capture One. It's great if you have high volume work because you can move through any application much faster with a range of inputs like this. You don't have to have the tools up on screen. You could work in Capture One completely full screen if you wanted to, and then access more than 500 functions on that system alone. So if you have high throughput, high volume work, it can save you an inordinate amount of time. You can imagine these kind of products are relatively high value, but something like the Ripple, is an under $300 option if you think you're going to be spending a lot of time color grading. While we're talking about input panels, something at a lower price point, let me just bring up a picture for you if I can find it. My mistake. I thought I had it preloaded for you, but we've also made our own keyboard. Let's find it, Logic keyboard. So our very own keyboard for Capture One, which basically has, here we go. I'll stop waffling and just show you a picture. Our own keyboard for Capture One, which has a number of shortcuts printed on it just to help you remember and visualize the shortcut process. So we can all normally manage to remember the most common shortcuts that we use, but the ones that we use a little bit less are harder to remember. So now with color coding and having them visually written on the keys, then it's much easier to remember. So you can see over here, we've got color tagging when we talk about selection a bit later, star rating, and so on and so forth, and all the other various functionality here as well. If you're interested in this, then talk to your Phase One partner. And you can buy it direct from any Phase One partner. Currently Mac only. There's no reason why it won't work with the PC because it's just a USB keyboard, but it's based on the Apple aluminium keyboard and it has very Mac-centric things like the command button and so on. So it might not be as nice to use on the PC, just as a warning. So yes, Chris, the keyboard is Mac compatible. I can't recommend it highly enough. I'm using one as we speak. I personally thought I don't need one. I can remember all the shortcuts, but all the kind of obscure stuff like these ones here about setting the various different counters, especially if you shoot tethered. We've got decrement capture counter, reset capture counter, import capture counter, the rename capture counter, and the export capture counter. So I can't hope to remember all of those, but having them printed there makes life much easier. So that was new for 10. Okay, and if you want to use that, if we go to Edit Keyboard Shortcuts, we've got a preloaded list that works directly with the Logic keyboard, as you can see, available in UK and US and German shortly as well, as far as I know. Okay, so the next kind of new tool, and then this is going back in time a bit, but it's also an interesting exercise to see how something as simple as clarity can actually be handled in a variety of different ways. So what is clarity, first of all? Well, clarity is basically a contrast adjustment, but if we grab our contrast slider again, and quite often if we're too aggressive with contrast, it's not so pleasant for the shadows and highlights because they get dark, obviously, relatively quickly. So what the clarity slider does, if we do a similarly aggressive clarity adjustment, is that we're only affecting the contrast in the midtones. So by only affecting the contrast in the midtones, it simply means that we don't block up our shadows, we don't blow out our highlights, but we get this nice overall pop to the image like so. And that's maximum. I probably wouldn't do that much. We'd back it off a bit. Let's go max again so you can see the difference, because we actually have 4 different clarity methods, which might sound excessive, but again, they all do a slightly different job of handling clarity. So if we switch to punch, watch what happens with the color. Saturation just goes up a bit. So punch will just give you a bit more boost for colors. Neutral is somewhere in between natural and punch. And then classic is a really old method, which looks kind of super ugly. But some people like to use it. That's from Capture One 6. So you can really see the progression here from, Capture One 6, and then Capture One 7, we added neutral, and then and punch, and then Capture One 9, we added natural, which is a really good compromise between everything. Structure hasn't seen any changes, but it's good to know what it does. It just basically enhances anything with a sort of edge structure like so, as you can see. But if you've never played with the different clarity methods, have a look. It's worth it. Keywords, let's just flick to a batch of images like so. I'll just cover this quickly. It was added in Capture One 9, so new keyword tool and new keyword library tool. And what this simply meant was that we had an accelerated way of adding keywords to images in a simple tool like so. And if I just type Alex, for example, that will add the keyword Alex to all those single images. If you want to know more about this, it's just worth looking at the various tutorials, written information, and so on. My big number one advice for using this is before you go nuts starting to add keywords to your images, start with a keyword library, which is a separate tool here. So the keyword library allows you to have a list of predefined keywords. And the reason why that's useful is because you don't want to get into the process of, say, spelling keywords differently, some with capitals, some without capitals, or spelling mistakes, and so on and so forth. So if you start with a good keyword library, then as you can see, as I was typing, if I type girl, for example, then it gives me various different options like this. Like so, I can just hit enter and it applies those, which are pulling from my keyword library down here. Now you can make your own keyword library simply by saying create a keyword library, or you can pull one from a text file. So I found, let's just go back to the internet again. This one here, Lightroom Keyword List Project. Again, if you're a Lightroom user out there, there's nothing to stop you exporting your current keyword list from Lightroom and bringing that into Capture One. Should work perfectly fine. But this was just one I found of a number of various free lists, but this one was pretty extensive. And the nice thing is about this list, as well as having the basic list, the author has also added some additional things like birds, body parts, candid, and so on. And all it is a very simple text list. So if we open up Finder, once you download it, it just simply looks like, where is it? This, just a very basic text file. And all we need to do in Capture One to use something like this is simply say create keyword library, new from a keyword text file, point to that, and then it will just import that instantly into Capture One, and you can actually see it down here. So this just gives me some consistency. So if I type in, what should we try? Hair. Don't even know if that belongs in the keyword, but yes, hair, body parts, what, like so. So that means I'm always going to be consistent with my keywording, for example. So I'd thoroughly recommend that list. It seems to be a really good start. Also, for other new tools, for those of you who are tethered shooters, let's just bring up the capture tool tab. Move this, let's just move this a bit further along. So for those of you shooting tethered, just going to turn on a camera for a second. Not that I'm going to shoot, but just want to show you what happens when we hook up a camera. So I've just plugged in a Sony A7. That was something that was added in version 8 as well, support for tethering of Sony cameras. We also redesigned the camera tool as well, so to look a bit more nice and user-friendly. Anything that's lit up light, you can change directly in Capture One, for example. We also have battery indication, which we added in version 9, I believe, as well, so I can see the current status of my camera battery. In next capture adjustments, we added a few additional things as well. So you'll see under orientation, you can either use the camera's sensor or you can have a manual setting. And you might think, why would I ever need to do that? Because my camera has a great rotational sensor. Yes, that's true. But often when you shoot overhead, straight down, like copying artwork or folded fashion or something like that, the orientation sensors can get confused, and they can often jump between 0, 90 degrees and so on. And the other benefit of changing the orientation here is that it also rotates the live view. So if I had a live view enabled camera here, for example, this particular one doesn't do live view, then it would also rotate our live view as well. So that's really handy, because in the past it meant live view was always stuck on landscape, which wasn't very helpful if you were shooting portrait, for example. So next capture adjustments, look out for orientation if you haven't seen it there before as well. We also added camera focus in version 10. So that allows you to jog and shuttle the focus. Excuse me. Depending on the camera attached, you might be able to do it without entering live view. Some Sony cameras you can just always influence the focus. For example, I can AF my camera here. Canon and Nikon, you have to be in live view, for example. For stability and speed, we now no longer have to rely on Canon and Nikon's SDK. All the connection protocols are written by us in-house. We have had some issues in the past with perhaps Apple or Windows launching a new operating system, which then breaks the Canon in particular, it was some years back, breaks the SDK, which means we then have to wait for Canon to update it, fix it, leaving you guys out in the cold without any way to tether. So now we have full control over that, and we've also seen up to 30% increase in speed as well when shooting tethered. So camera tool, camera settings tool was also added in 9. So camera settings, which gives you an even broader, deeper view, various different settings into the camera. Again, what we can see here is very dependent on the manufacturer, what they allow us to read, for example. Roger says, when will B&H Video in New York get the new keyboard? I don't know the specific stocking of all the various partners around the world, I'm afraid, but I know the first batch sold out very quickly. But I know you can pre-order on B&H, because Stuart has just said he has. So probably the best bet is to pre-order, and then you know you're next in line for the second batch, because the first batch went very, very quickly. Tony says on the next capture adjustments, can we make it default to default instead of copy from last? Yeah, absolutely. So copy from last, ICC profile, we can say default. All other, we can also say defaults. So that means we don't copy anything from the last one. It's just all the virgin, if you like, adjustments from the camera. So just change all other to defaults. By default, it looks like this. How do we know where you're focusing with the camera focus? Well, currently on this camera that's attached, it will just be using whatever I've set as my focus point. Excuse me. But some cameras, depending on what's attached, you can use the buttons here to jog the focus as well. Yes, Tony, it can stay that way. If you leave it to defaults, it will only ever use the defaults regardless of what you set. Excuse me. Right. Cull just said he got his keyboard from Digital Transitions in New York. Good stuff. Lutz says, can you clarify the difference between 9 and 10? In terms of processing engine, you won't see much difference in image quality, but what you will see for the processing engine between 9 and 10, if you remember right at the start, I said the processing engine can also influence quality. Sorry, performance. So you see this image here is from a 100 megapixel camera. If I just use my shortcut key to go to the next image, we can move through images pretty rapidly. We can scroll the image around. If we go from the previous image to the next image, then you can see it's pretty much instantaneous like so. So in terms of Capture One 9 and 10, processing engine wise, it was pretty much all about performance. Changed loads of stuff under the hood with regards to viewing images, browsing, and so on. Also, I remember I pointed out for Capture One 10 we had the proofing option, the new sharpening slider as well. Okay, so let's move on to the next one, which, just to finish off tools before we look at workflow, just a little mention. With local adjustments, we now increase the number of tools that are available as a local adjustment. So over the past couple of releases, we've added white balance, we've added high dynamic range, we've added noise reduction, we've added the curves tool. So curves is a local adjustment, and also the ability to do repair layers in local adjustments as well. So some basic retouching on the repair layers too. So if we think about workflow, a couple of things that's worth mentioning. Basic one, but nevertheless very useful. Right-clicking on an image allows you to edit with, or a round trip function. So I can say edit with, choose JPEG or TIFF, choose to go into Photoshop, and then Capture One will create my TIFF or JPEG, send that TIFF or JPEG alongside the raw file, and then at any point we could then open that TIFF or JPEG back into Photoshop, do more work on it, and then Capture One will update the preview and so on. So that's just a simple round trip process, edit with. It was designed primarily to work with Photoshop, but if you use other tools for doing your pixel pushing, then it's very likely that will work as well, but it was optimized for Photoshop being the most popular tool, of course. We've changed a whole bunch of stuff in Capture One regarding to culling, selecting, and rating, and there's really too much to sort of discuss in the next 5 or 10 minutes. My best advice is to have a look at one of the most recent webinars titled Culling, Selecting, and Rating, which was all about that process. Traditionally, especially those of you on Lightroom, quite often try to look for tools that are the same as Lightroom. That's a perfectly natural thing to do. So things like pick, reject, and flag, and so on, which we don't have in Capture One, but we have a myriad of color filters, and of course we have a myriad of star ratings, which can all be accessed by shortcuts as well. If we go up to the edit menu, you'll see that we have added a whole bunch of stuff in here, and one of the most useful ones was select by. So the ability with a shortcut key to be able to select by rating, color tag, or from a file name list. So if you've been given a list of file names, for example, like so, you can enter the file names here. I actually did have a list. Let's see if I still have it. Let's see, not anymore, I don't think. No, but basically you can just put file names in here and then Capture One will pull them out of a selection for you. So if you've sent off 1,000 images to your client and they return a list of 200, rather than having to find them individually, you can just pop the names in here and Capture One will pick them out. But if I just use a shortcut key to, let's just make a few 5 stars. If we do edit, select by rating, which will be Command 5, that would be the fast way to do it. You see all my 5 stars are selected. So let's clear that selection and do Command 5, then straight away. So as well as select by rating, we've got color tag and shortcut keys, of course, as well, and the powerful file name list. We also added something really useful. Let's hide my tools, Command T. Let's just bring up this image in the viewer, and let's place my browser at the bottom. Again, we can do all of this with shortcut keys. Let's zoom out from 100%. What we also added was something called sets. So often when you're moving through images, which we can also do nice and quickly with Capture One 10, again faster than Capture One 9, what we can also do is look at images in a set, for example. So sometimes it's more useful to be able to look at, say, 4 images at once, like so. So I've just done a shift select, so shift select 4 images, and then we might want to look at the next 4 images, for example. So if we look at the actual option here, edit, select next set, option right arrow, that will go to the next set. So now if I use my shortcut keys, I can just move through banks of 4 images like so, and then when I'm within a set, I can use my cursor keys to look at those and perhaps give one of them, a 5-star rating. Let's go to the previous set. Let's give that one a 5-star rating. Next set, let's give that 5 stars. Next set, I like this one, 5 stars. Next set, let's grab this one, 5 stars, and then eventually we're going to run out of images, I would think. Let's take that one, and that I'm at the end of my set. So now if I say Command 5, like so, then that's instantly pulled out all the 5-star images that I just selected. So there's all kinds of stuff you can do with the culling and rating. We can also right click on images themselves as well. And we can also say create albums from rating, color tag, and selection. We can select by the same rating. We can select by the same color tag, the same variant position. There is so much to culling and rating in Capture One. You're easily going to find a way to do high-level selecting and rating from a huge amount of images down to a small amount very quickly. As I said, have a look in the webinar archive for the webinar specifically on that, and you'll pick up loads of great tips as such. Okay, find and replace, kind of a bit of a nerdy one, but it's actually really can be a huge lifesaver. So let's just select all, right click and say batch rename. We've got 2 ways of renaming. We can use text and tokens, so we can simply type in here and we can use a token. And a token in Capture One, this kind of gray lozenge, pulls some aspect of metadata out of the image and uses that for naming. But we can also do find and replace naming. So if let's say we did a spelling mistake in the file name, we used the wrong product code, we used the wrong model name, we used the wrong client or something like that, we can simply say find anything, say called CF in this case, and then replace it with Alex, like so. So you can see here it's given us a sample. CF will be replaced by Alex, but the other element of the file name will remain completely intact. So imagine trying to do that manually on 1,000 images. If you just realized at the end of a shooting session you totally messed up your naming convention, that is a really good, fast, easy fix. The last thing that I will probably mention today, I think, is a little bit on just dynamic locations. So dynamic locations again uses a Capture One token to extract some kind of metadata from the image and use that on export. So if I just go to a different collection here, we've got 13 images, for example. They've got a variety of different star ratings, as you can see, just underneath the images like so. And a very simple thing we can do with dynamic locations is just ask Capture One to place images in folders based on metadata like something like star rating. So let's say I just want to have, let's put this back to 1600 pixels like so, not 16 million, 1600 pixels like so. Turn this process recipe on. In my output location is going to a folder here. Let's just show you where that folder is. Pictures, my exports, set as output folder. I'm just going to delete those exports from the earlier webinar so you can see it from scratch. So in my subfolder, I can add some text in here, and Capture One will happily manually create me that folder, or I can use a token. So if I click on the button here, and these are all the various different tokens which we can use, which again is some kind of metadata identifier for the image. It could be the rating, it could be the color tag, it could be the date the image was shot, it could be the serial number of the camera, it could be today's date, it could be the contents of the clipboard, it could be all kinds of things. Well, let's just do something really basic and grab rating. These are just various categories which will make the list smaller and easier to manage. So let's drag rating in there as well and say OK. So now what happens is based on the rating, it'll go into a folder specific to that. So we've got 13 images, one process recipe, let's say process. Let's click on the arrow, that will take me to Finder. And you can see here we've got a folder called number 4, a folder called number 5. You can see the process dialog zipping along here quite nicely. I don't know if I had any other 3 stars. We'll find out in a minute. I think I did. Yes. There's a 3-star in there somewhere. There's our 3-star, and so on and so forth. And that process is done. So an easy sorting of images into 3, 4, and 5, but that could be colors as well. Let's delete those, and let's also turn on, let's have some full-size TIFFs, like so. And we can have more than one token. Now I know my token names, or some of them, so I know I have one called recipe name, so I can just start typing and Capture One will suggest. So I have recipe name, and now I'm going to put a / in, and then I'm going to have rating as we did before, like so. The / simply means we get another level down in the structure. So if I say process now, click on my arrow, then you see I've got my full-size TIFFs going in their star ratings, and then I've got my JPEGs in their star ratings as well. So I could keep going and going with tokens if I wanted to, and you can do very sort of efficient things like so. So that's a really nice thing that you don't have to keep going into some kind of export dialog. You just mark the process recipes that you want to have and hit go. Also, process recipes don't always have to go to the same location like this Instagram recipe. If we look in the File tab, by default, it'll say look to output location, which means use it here. But what I can do is just select any other folder and send it to there. So let's pretend I have a Dropbox, like so. And this is what I specifically do for my own stuff that I put on Instagram. Rather than saving to my laptop, I save it to Dropbox on my laptop with a subfolder using the current date. So let's say we wanted to put this guy on Instagram for whatever reason. If you want to go square, I've got 2048 by 2048. Let's turn those off. But I want a crop square, so in my crop tool, I can say crop to the output. So now when I start cropping, I'm going to get a square like so. So let's say I want to do that for Instagram. And now when I process, it's going to go to that Dropbox folder, and it's going to go in subfolder with today's date. So that's easy for me because it goes to Dropbox. I pick up my phone, I go to Dropbox, I export that image to my phone, and then I can post on Instagram. So if I say process now, let's go here, and then we've got March what is the date today? Good question. It's the 2nd, isn't it? March the 2nd. And there's my image like so, cropped to 2048 by 2048. And then if this was an actual Dropbox, it would be merrily uploading to my phone, and then I could pull it down and do that upload. So process recipes with dynamic locations, very powerful, means we can have process recipes either going to a default location or going to their own individual location. So if you haven't mastered that, well worth getting your head around it, can save you a huge amount of time. Okay, before we have to go, let's just pull out the last few questions. Can you tether wirelessly? No, you can't. It's via a USB connection or Firewire if you happen to have phase one. Disadvantage of tethering wirelessly is basically performance. If you shoot Canon, Nikon, Sony, Canon and Nikon in particular, as soon as you've taken the shot, pretty much instantaneously, it's sitting there in Capture One waiting for you with a fully color managed preview. It's not possible to do that wirelessly at the same speed. And most of our clients, it's all about the performance as much as possible. How big is the influence of a powerful graphics card on performance? It's definitely a big influence. Capture One can use the graphics card quite heavily if you wish. You can turn it on and off in the preferences. So under General, we can say Hardware Acceleration, Auto or Never. Always good to put it on Auto for a first try. It will speed up things like zooming into 100%. Processing, and so on, browsing through images at speed and so on. See, these are rendering to 100% pretty much almost instantaneously. So having a good graphics card will really help you with that as well. But things like SSD drives, good RAM, good processor can equally be as important as well. Les says, in local adjustments, can you use the same tool with different adjustments on a new layer? For example, 2 curve layers or 2 color editor layers. Yeah, of course you can. No limitations at all. Upgrading from 9 to 10, do we need to open the catalog rather than import it? Yes, really important. If you upgrade from 9 to 10 or 7 to 10 or whatever, you don't have to do anything fancy with importing catalogs. You just open the catalog as you would do before. You'll get a dialog which will say this catalog needs to be upgraded, but you don't have to do anything else. When you use the batch rename, does it only affect the export batch or does it change the file? It will change the file name. So batch rename will change the physical file name on your hard drive. Just be aware of that. Where is this graphic card thing? Where is the graphic card thing? The graphic card thing is in your computer, and it controls basically all the graphics processes. So displaying images up on screen and so on. But in more recent years, what we've been able to do is use the power of that graphics processor to do other stuff, because it's a very powerful processor, so why not use it to do some heavy lifting for like processing images and so on. So as well as making images appear faster on the screen and browsing as you saw just a second ago, it can also help with tasks like export speed and all that sort of stuff. But this is all at 100%, so of course we can zip through nicely and almost instantaneously up to 100%, as you can see. Okay, I think that pretty much takes us to the end. I just want to bring up next week's webinar, because this should be a good interest for you. So next week we have a webinar with a guest, which is always great, which is Michael Wolowosniich, if I've said that correctly. And he's a great guy out of Canada, and he's going to show us again how he uses Capture One in specifically with portraiture, and again more specifically with local adjustments for dodging and burning, for example. And there was a new feature added in 10, flow control, which I mentioned briefly earlier, which allows a nice slow controlled build up of the mask, which is important for all aspects of local adjustments, but makes dodging and burning much easier. So he's going to come along on the 16th and be my guest from Canada and talk about that. So if you can sign up, do so. In the follow-up email, which comes out in roughly an hour's time, then you'll see a link for that. Also, for those of you who haven't upgraded, as it's a Thursday and we're feeling generous, there will also be a discount code if you want to upgrade as well. But it's time limited. It will only last until the 6th of March. So if you've felt that it's worth upgrading, then do so quickly, because there's a nice discount waiting for you in that follow-up email, roughly in about an hour's time as well. Okay. Many thanks for your time today, everybody. I hope it was useful. I hope it wasn't too much of a hard sell as such, but I think it's with something like Capture One, when you open up the various different versions, it's not necessarily immediately obvious what's changed. It's not like buying a brand new car. As soon as you sit in it, you know everything's new and shiny. But something like Capture One, often you have to dig a bit deeper or have a bit of an explanation over what's changed. But any of you on versions 7, 8, 9, you're not going to be disappointed if you upgrade to 10. I mean, 10 alone is worth it just for the performance increase, for example. So time is money. We don't have enough time, so anything that does stuff for you quicker has got to be a worthy investment, of course. Okay, thanks again all for your time, and I hope to see you again on the next webinar on the 16th. Take care.